In the early 1960s, when Americans were already watching live rocket launches on television and engineers in Houston were drawing up the first flight plans to the moon, there was a single street in Berlin that showed, in miniature, what the whole Cold War was really about. On one side of that street, people could see American tanks rumble past and Western news crews film right up against a growing wall of concrete. On the other side, people saw only the gray uniforms of border troops and the backs of buildings whose windows had been bricked up by order of a Soviet-backed state. The street was called Bernauer Straße. When the Berlin Wall went up in August 1961, Bernauer Straße became one of the most dramatic fault lines on the planet. The legal border ran right down the middle of the pavement. The facades and front doors of the buildings on one side were suddenly in East Berlin, while the sidewalk and roadway in front of them belonged to the West. For a few terrible weeks, East Germans jumped from their own windows directly into West Berlin fire nets, while Soviet-backed guards tried to drag them back from rooftops and stairwells. Eventually, the windows were bricked up. The buildings on the eastern side were evacuated, gutted, and in some cases torn down altogether. In their place, the authorities built a wide death strip of raked sand, barbed wire, dog runs, and patrol tracks, backed up by watchtowers with searchlights and Kalashnikov-armed soldiers trained to shoot anyone who tried to cross. If you stood on the western sidewalk, you could watch this process happen almost in real time. You could see the hardware of Soviet bloc border technology being layered into a city block that had once been just another neighborhood. And if you were a young West Berliner with a good sense of direction and a stubborn streak, you could not help noticing something else. The technology on the surface was new and intimidating, but the soil underneath that strip had not changed at all. Underground, there were still basements, old utility tunnels, stretches of stable clay. The wall did not reach 12 meters down. That thought lodged itself in the minds of a group of West Berliners in 1963 and 1964, students, apprentices, and a few seasoned escape helpers who saw Bernauer Straße as more than a stage for propaganda. They saw it as an engineering problem. On the western side, at number 97 Bernauer Straße, there was an empty bakery. The ovens were cold, the display cases bare, but the building had one extremely valuable feature, a basement very close to the borderline, with thick walls and enough space to work without being easily noticed from the street. From that basement, the distance under the death strip to the backyards of the east was on the order of 150 meters, a long way to dig by hand, but not impossible. The first attempt from that bakery took shape in 1963. Escapers picked a target cellar on the eastern side and, using only tape measures, compasses, and a few rough sketches, tried to aim their tunnel toward a coal store beneath a residential building. They dug for about 5 months, hauling out soil in sacks, shoring up the passage with scrap timber, and praying that their calculations were right. When they finally broke through, their tunnel emerged exactly where they had feared it might, in a coal storage space that was directly in the field of vision of East German border guards. Only 3 young women managed to escape through that first bakery tunnel before the route was discovered and sealed. It was a failure, but a very instructive one. The people involved learned 3 critical lessons. First, shallow tunnels that came up close to the facades were far too easy to spot and too easy for the border troops to destroy once found. Second, calculations based only on building plans and guesswork left too much room for small errors in aim to turn into big problems at the exit. And third, Bernauer Straße's subsoil, heavy, compact clay, could probably support a much deeper tunnel than they had dared to attempt the first time. So they went back to work. In 1964, roughly 35 West Berliners, many of them students from the Free University, formed a new team and returned to the dark, damp basement of the bakery at Bernauer Straße 97. They were not engineers on paper, but they had all the instincts of a field engineering crew. They reviewed what had gone wrong, remeasured their starting point, and redesigned the project from the ground up. This time, they would go deeper, straighter, and safer. Among them were men whose later biographies would tie this little underground operation directly to the wider technological story of the Cold War. One was Reinhard Führer, a physics student who would eventually become a West German astronaut and fly on the American Space Shuttle Challenger in 1985, literally going from digging under the wall to orbiting the Earth with NASA. Another was Wolfgang Fuchs, an experienced escape helper who had already been involved in earlier tunnels and knew what it meant to work under the constant threat of discovery. If the Soviet side had its rocketry program and military engineers, this little group at Bernauer Straße was the West's answer in miniature, ad hoc, improvisational, powered by curiosity and technical problem-solving rather than by orders from above. The new tunnel would become known as Tunnel 57. Their first crucial decision was depth. Instead of skimming just below debasements, they dropped a shaft down around 12 meters, roughly the height of a 4-story building turned upside down beneath the ground. At that depth, the vibrations of their digging were less likely to reach the surface, and the chance that they would accidentally intersect cables, pipes, or the foundations of the wall itself was much lower. From the bottom of that shaft, they began driving a horizontal gallery toward the east. The planned length was about 145 meters, linking the bakery basement on Bernauer Straße directly to a courtyard on Strelitzer Straße 55 in East Berlin. There were no laser rangefinders, no GPS devices, no digital maps. There was only clay, timber, sweat, and an almost obsessive attention to angles and distance. They measured, checked, and rechecked, marking their progress on rough sketches by the light of bare bulbs strung along the growing tunnel. The tools were brutally simple: shovels and pickaxes to break up the soil, homemade carts and buckets to haul the earth back to the shaft, wooden planks scavenged from construction sites to brace the roof and walls and keep the clay from collapsing on top of them. They strung electric cables from the bakery basement to power small lamps, turning the underground space into something like a low-ceilinged, muddy corridor carved by hand. The ingenuity was not in the hardware, it was in the workflow. They worked in shifts, often at night or during hours when ambient noise on the street masked the faint sounds of digging. They disguised the removal of soil, hiding it behind false walls or dispersing it in attics and other parts of the building so neighbors wouldn't see suspicious piles of earth appearing from nowhere. Every time they thought they heard footsteps too close overhead, they froze, lamps dimmed, hearts pounding. While this subterranean engineering went on, another equally delicate operation was taking place above ground, recruiting and organizing the people who would actually use the tunnel. On the eastern side, contacts, known as couriers, quietly spread the word to friends, relatives, and trusted acquaintances. There was a project underway that might, if all went well, offer them a way under the wall. These couriers had to be careful. Every conversation could contain a Stasi informant. Every mention of escape could be reported and added to someone's growing file. Over weeks and months, they built a list of about 120 East Germans who were ready to risk everything. People of all ages, young couples, older parents, sometimes children. Some had already been in trouble with the authorities. Others were simply tired of living in a country whose government needed machine guns and minefields to keep them inside. The agreed-upon meeting point on the eastern side was a courtyard on Strelitzer Straße 55. On maps, it looked like any other East Berlin apartment block. In reality, its disused outhouse, an old toilet shed in the yard, was about to become one of the most unlikely portals to the West in Cold War history. The plan had been to bring the tunnel up into the cellar of the residential building itself, but as the gallery advanced under the border and into the yard, the diggers realized that their line had drifted slightly off the original calculation. When they finally broke through, they weren't directly under the house, they were under the old, out-of-use toilet-in house in the courtyard. In almost any other context, that would have been a mistake. Here, it was a gift. The outhouse was a secondary structure, neglected and rarely visited. It offered good cover. Fugitives could slip in one or two at a time without drawing the same attention as a stream of people entering a main stairwell. Inside, under a layer of boards and debris, was the hidden entrance to the tunnel that would carry them under the death strip and into the basement of a bakery in the west. The western end of the route, bakery to shaft to tunnel, was ready by autumn 1964. The eastern end, courtyard to outhouse to hidden ladder, was quietly prepared by couriers who knew exactly how close the Stasi was watching. All that remained was to pick the nights. They settled on 3 and 4 October 1964. Those dates sat just before the 15th anniversary of the GDR's founding, a time when propaganda was at full volume and the regime was particularly sensitive to any sign of dissent. Pulling off a mass escape right under the noses of East German and Soviet security in that moment would be a symbolic blow far beyond the numbers alone. On the evening of 3 October, small groups of East Berliners began drifting towards Bernauer Straße 55. They came in ones and twos, trying to look like neighbors visiting friends or residents going about their business. They carried almost nothing: a small bag, a document, maybe one treasured keepsake that could be slipped into a coat. In the courtyard, they were met by Reinhard Führer in his role not as future astronaut, but as would-be smuggler. He checked names off a mental list, watching for anything that looked like a tail or a trap. If he was satisfied, he guided each person or group to the outhouse, slipped them inside, and showed them the concealed entrance. One by one, people descended a short shaft, dropped into the tunnel, and began crawling. The passage was barely high enough to move on elbows and knees. The air was humid and smelled of earth and sweat. The only light came from bulbs strung at intervals, forming a dim, wavering line that marked the path to the west. Imagine an older couple, perhaps in their 50s, who have lived their whole lives in the east. They drop into that tunnel knowing that if it collapses, they will die buried where no one will find them. Ahead of them might be a teenager, behind them a young mother trying to coax a child not to cry. Each meter forward takes them a little farther away from a regime that has already turned their street into a militarized zone. At the far end, in the basement of the bakery on Bernauer Straße, Western helpers wait in near silence. Each time a figure emerges from the low opening, they grab arms and shoulders, help the person up, and usher them into a side room. There's a quick check: name, relation, any visible injury. Then they are hustled out through the building and into West Berlin proper, where other volunteers guide them to safe houses and processing centers. By the end of that first night, dozens have made the journey. No alarms, no sudden flood of searchlights into the courtyard, no Stasi raid on the outhouse. For a moment, it seems as if this might be the rare Cold War operation that goes exactly as planned. The second night, 4 October, begins in the same way. Again, fugitives gather. Again, couriers bring them in. Again, Führer stands in that yard, trying to read every face. But this time, the danger is closer. Among the 120 names on the original list of potential escapees, there was at least one informant for the Stasi. At some point in the planning, word of the tunnel reached the Ministry for State Security. As so often happened in East Germany, the regime's response was to turn human trust into an instrument of control. On the ground, that meant that plainclothes agents began appearing where the couriers operated, adding a new layer of risk to every move. On that second night at Bernauer Straße 55, two such men turned up in the courtyard and claimed they wanted to escape, and that they had a friend they needed to fetch. That strange insistence set nerves on edge among the organizers. Meanwhile, East German border troops and security personnel, tipped off that something was happening in the area, began to tighten their net around the block. Patrol routes were adjusted. More men were posted in nearby streets. The outhouse, once invisible, was suddenly very close to the center of attention. In the confusion of those hours, as people tried to judge who could be trusted and who could not, shots rang out near the yard. In the chaos, a 21-year-old border guard named Egon Schultz was hit and fatally wounded. The East German regime responded in the only way it knew. Its propaganda machine immediately declared Schultz a hero, insisting that he had been murdered by West Berlin terrorists associated with the tunnel. Schools and streets were named after him. Ceremonies were held in his honor. In the official narrative, the lesson was clear. The wall and its guardians were under attack by agents of the class enemy, and every citizen had a duty to support their defense. What those citizens were never told is what documents from the Stasi files would reveal decades later. Egon Schultz died from friendly fire, killed by bullets from another East German soldier in the confusion of the operation. The authorities knew it. They altered reports and silenced witnesses to preserve a more convenient story. For the people who built and used Tunnel 57, that truth was bitter but unsurprising. They had always known that the regime would twist events to fit its own myth. What mattered to them was that despite everything, the informants, the tightening patrols, the gunfire in the night, 57 men, women, and children had crawled through that clay tube and come out in the west. 57. That number gave the tunnel its name. In the statistics of the Cold War, it's a small figure. Tens of thousands of East Germans escaped by various routes over the life of the wall. Millions left the Eastern Bloc through legal and semi-legal channels before and after. But in the history of underground escapes from Berlin, 57 stands out. No other single tunnel project brought so many people out in so few nights. The comparison with other tunnels makes this even clearer. Tunnel 29, an earlier project also involving students and young engineers, succeeded in bringing 29 people out before being shut down. Many other tunnels were shorter, shallower, and more vulnerable, sometimes collapsing, sometimes intercepted by Stasi counter-tunnels designed specifically to cross likely escape routes. Against that backdrop, a 145-meter tunnel dug to a depth of 12 meters, connecting a bakery basement in the west to an abandoned outhouse in the east, and moving 57 people in 2 nights, looks less like an improvised stunt and more like a small-scale civil engineering marvel. From an American vantage point, there's a particular resonance here. The same decade that saw Reinhard Furrer and his friends crawling through mud under Bernauer Straße also saw American astronauts training to ride the Saturn V, computers becoming central to both civilian and military planning, and transatlantic broadcasts turning the whole world into a kind of shared theater. On one side of the Iron Curtain, technology was being used to open horizons. On the other, it was being used to close them. The East German state, backed by Soviet expertise, deployed microphones in the ground, seismographs, patrol tunnels, and networks of informants trying to detect and stop exactly this kind of operation. Yet, a group of young people with shovels and physics textbooks still found a way to beat that system, at least for a while. In later years, when Furrer flew aboard the American space shuttle, reporters and historians drew a line between his 2 undergrounds, the clay under a Berlin street and the blackness of orbit. In both cases, he was part of a team that used limited physical tools and deep technical understanding to cross a line most people assumed was impassable. Today, if you walk the length of Bernauer Straße, you will not see the bakery or the outhouse as they once were. You will see instead the Berlin Wall Memorial, with steel outlines marking where buildings stood and panels explaining what happened beneath your feet. A plaque in the pavement notes the location of Tunnel 57. Exhibits and guided tours describe how on 3rd and 4th October 1964, 57 people went from east to west without ever touching the wall above. Digital reconstructions show the shaft dropping down from the bakery basement, the tunnel angling under the strip, and the small, almost comic-sounding outhouse that hid the entrance on the other side. But when you hear survivors talk about it, about the fear, the darkness, the sound of their own breath echoing off gray walls, it becomes clear that there was nothing funny about it at all. For American viewers, the story of the Bernauer Straße bakery tunnel is a chance to see the Cold War stripped of slogans and reduced to its essentials. On one side, a state that poured talent and resources into keeping its people in, building higher walls, deeper ditches, more sensitive microphones, and more elaborate myths to justify them. On the other, a world that, for all its flaws, inspired people to risk everything for the chance to join it, and that quietly supported those efforts with media attention, political backing, and, in the case of some escape helpers, financial and logistical help from Western organizations. The tunnel from bakery to outhouse was not a NASA mission. It did not involve supercomputers or rocket stages. It was mud, timber, sweat, and a length of cable running down from a basement that smelled of old flour. But in the way it combined practical physics, human coordination, and moral purpose, it belongs to the same family of stories, people using knowledge and courage to get beyond a barrier that someone else insisted must never be crossed. When the Soviet-backed authorities studied their own reports about Tunnel 57, they saw a technical problem: how to improve detection, how to plug a vulnerability under a particular street. When people in the West looked at the same episode, they saw something else: proof that even at the height of the Cold War, even in a city divided by one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth, the most powerful force in play was still the desire to be free and the willingness of ordinary people to apply every bit of ingenuity they had to make that desire real.